Yeah, I'm Chen, and from the Department of Cultural Studies. Yeah, so welcome everybody. And so I think you, like me, I think all of you must be very much attracted by the topic. Yeah, so when I received the message from Sija, I was so thrilled by the topic. Yeah, and also by knowing that Professor Jonathan Dawson, yeah, and his background, yeah, is so interesting, yeah. So maybe I'll just briefly, well, we welcome Professor first, okay? So we are very happy to have Jonathan here. So I think to like reflect upon, yeah, the dominant economic ideologies and philosophies now we sort of like face in this world, yeah, or we have sort of internalized, yeah, and try to use like this word Buddhism, so it's treated as a kind of ancient wisdom, yeah, or ancient wisdom to reflect upon our dilemmas now we are living in this world, you know, that kind of maybe wrong concept of economics, yeah, or kind of wrong practice of it, yeah. So I think we not only draw resources from Buddhism, but also on holistic science and ecosystem design, that sort of things, yeah. Okay, yeah. So today Jonathan will speak for around like 45 minutes, and then we will have Dr. Sip Choi, yeah, and from the Southwest universities in Sichuan, yeah, to be the commentator, yeah, a little bit of response to Jonathan's talk, and then we'll open the floor for questions, yeah, and dialogues. Okay, so that hope that you will have questions to ask and also response to the talk. Okay, so Jonathan.
So thank you for the invitation. So already I'm feeling very much at home because I teach in a place called Schumacher College in England. It's a very distinctive learning environment, and one of the things that's distinctive is that the students and the staff are involved in growing the food, in cooking the vegetables, in cleaning up, in cleaning the toilets, in doing everything. We're a self-managing community. So to arrive here this morning and to find that the students are, as part of their curriculum, are engaged in growing food, to me, makes me happy. I'm a professor of economics, but I'm also profoundly interested in pedagogy, in educational theory and how we learn. And I noticed that that when I teach a program, I'm thinking recently I taught a program on the food economy. And at the end of the course, we asked students what were their highlights of the program. And all the highlights were harvesting the vegetables, cooking the food. It was very much about embodied learning. And I'm persuaded that as long as we limit ourselves to sitting and listening and thinking, that there's a very much a limit on how much we can deeply learn and be transformed by the learning. So I really think, I mean, certainly in the college that I teach at, where the students and the staff are working together in growing food, in cooking food, in cleaning, in caring for our home, this is not just using the students as cheap labour. It is part of the curriculum because we realise that our experience of 25 years of doing this is that it is exactly by working together as teams, physically using our bodies and our emotions, that we really deeply learn. So unfortunately we live in a world where conventional educational theory is that when you enter a classroom, you leave your body, you leave your emotions, you leave your intuition outside. They're not accepted in academic context, whereas very much our philosophy and our understanding is that unless as students you bring all of your faculties, so your intuitive intelligence, your emotional intelligence into the classroom, there's a limit on what we can do together. So, as I say, I'm very happy to come to the university and find students engaged not just in thinking but in doing. I'm just going to show you. So this is E.F. Schumacher, Fritz Schumacher, the guy that Schumacher College is named after. He wrote, his most famous book is called Small is Beautiful. Is he known?
He's got a Chinese version.
You got the Chinese version, good. But how many people have heard of Small is Beautiful? Fritz Schumacher. So it's a generational thing mostly. The older ones know about it. I strongly recommend it. He's very interesting. He died 50 years ago, and he wrote 3 very small books of essays, one of which is called Small is Beautiful. But they're profoundly important. And I recently reread Small is Beautiful, and it felt like it had been written last week. So real visionary work. So I strongly recommend the book to you. Small is Beautiful. And as you walk into Schumacher College, there's a quote from Schumacher above the door which says, an ounce of practice is worth a ton of theory. So in other words, limiting ourselves just to the theoretical has its limitations. But we need to be seeing ourselves not just as thinkers, but as actors in the world. And the first time that I'm aware of anybody using the words Buddhist and economics together is from Small is Beautiful. I think that today, in recent years and recent decades, we're seeing a growing number of books and articles that really reflect on Buddhism and economics together, but I'm pretty sure that the first person to put the two things together was Schumacher, and this would have been in the 1960s, where he was profoundly influenced by a visit to Burma and a study of Burmese culture. Burma, Myanmar. Just a few words on Schumacher first of all, because his journey was an extraordinary intellectual journey, because he himself was a very conventional statistician. So he was the chief economist for the British, he himself was German, but he was the chief economist for the National Coal Board. So a very conventional fossil fuel based nationalised industry. He was a statistician. He had worked with Keynes, who was one of the great economists of the early part of the 20th century. But really he was not a maverick. He was working as a conventional economist in a conventional organisation. And then he visited Burma, and suddenly everything in his world changed. And this was when he started to, he himself was a Christian, so I think that he was looking more to spirituality and wisdom traditions than specifically Buddhism. But nonetheless, by drawing particularly on the tradition in Burma, he was looking particularly at how the contrast between conventional economic thinking and what wisdom traditions, in this case Buddhism, would bring to a study of economics. So, have any of you had the misfortune to study economics? Has anybody studied economics? You lucky people. Only one. So we'll try to go slowly so you can catch up. Because truly the way that economics is taught around the world is, I find it completely extraordinary. It's a discipline that really for the last 100 years, the other faculties have been saying to the economics faculty, the whole premises and assumptions on which you're basing your models are false. And the economics profession's response to this information has been this. It's been to say, if we change our assumptions about human nature, we can't do the model. So we need to abandon mathematics, we need to abandon economics as a mathematical discipline. So, and I want to explore this question of human nature and the importance of how we understand. These are ontological questions. Questions of who are we as a species? How do we learn? What makes us happy? Which are questions that really Schumacher, through his visit to Burma, began to ask himself. And he came to conclusions that were completely contradictory to the basic assumptions made by the economics faculty, by economic studies, of who we are as a species. And this is what I want to explore in the talk this morning. So, there were there were a number of things that Schumacher learned from his study, his being in Burma, and just watching a very different type of society. And there were, of all the many things that he learned, I think there were two particular insights that he came away with that were particularly revolutionary and challenging to conventional economics. So the first insight is that work, in fact, is not a disutility. You recognize Charlie Chaplin? This is from Hard Times. So this idea that work is a disutility, that economics is it's got such an ugly language. The disutility means that in the way of understanding the world to make the models work is that work is seen as being something that you don't like doing, but you do it in order to gain utility, which means that you work against your free will, you work in order to earn money because meaning in life is as a consumer. You get it? So the disutility is work, which you almost by definition don't enjoy, but you do it in order to get the money so that you can get utility, which is buying things. And Schumacher's observation in Burma was that actually meaning and pleasure in life came precisely from work, from good quality work. So rather than work as being something negative that we put up with in order to earn the money to buy things, that actually the meaningful, dignified, high quality life is defined by doing work that you love doing. Which to me seems kind of obvious, but it was really a deep challenge to profound a basis of economic thinking. The second insight was, how do we achieve abundance? So again, in conventional Western, now globalized economic thinking, economics is defined as the discipline of scarcity. So the assumption is that human wants will always exceed the ability of ecosystems to supply. So the demand for goods and services will always be greater than the availability of goods and services. And so economics is the discipline of allocation. In a world of scarcity, how do we allocate? And again, Schumacher's observation from being in Burma was that actually cultivated men and women were achieving abundance by consciously reducing their needs and their wants rather than by increasing. Does this make any sense to you intuitively? So this idea, is Buddhism still widely practiced in Hong Kong? So this idea of meditation as a practice in self-observation and noticing that as we become trapped as consumers, always wanting more, there's this concept of the hungry ghosts in Buddhism that can never, they've got tiny mouths, they can never take enough nourishment to feed themselves, continually needing more, and by buying and becoming addicted to consumption, we realize that we don't achieve abundance, but rather we simply become even more hungry for more stimulation and more satisfaction. So again, conventional economic thinking being that we need that we achieve well-being, we achieve abundance, we achieve richness through consuming stuff. And Schumacher's observation in Burma was it's exactly the opposite. That it is by recognizing an inherent feeling of well-being within oneself. So, in other words, well-being and happiness is to be achieved inside rather than outside. And that the more we become addicted to consumption, to consumerism, the more we simply throw fuel on the fire of dissatisfaction. Again, I just want to pause to see if this makes sense. I'm looking for some body language. Does this seem crazy, or does it feel like there is maybe some truth in it? Okay, I'm seeing some nodding of heads. I mean, certainly it was the whole Western model is based on the assumption, on two assumptions that Schumacher found his experience in Burma profoundly challenged. On the one hand, the assumption that you do work as a disutility in order to earn money to buy things which gave you well-being, and that well-being was provided by getting more and more stuff. And his observation of this deep wisdom tradition in East Asia was contradicted exactly these two core assumptions in Western economics. So first of all, the meaning in life is gained through high-quality work, and therefore the object of intelligent economic planning is full employment. It's not growth, but full employment. And full employment in high-quality, meaningful work. And then, secondly, that the route to abundance and well-being is less to do with looking outside and trying to get more stuff. Abundance is achieved by reducing wants rather than by increasing. So this is, and again, this is the, it seems incredible that after the attack on the Twin Towers in 9/11, that the President of the United States went on television within hours of the attack and said to the American people, the terrorists will not destroy the American way of life. Go shopping. So save civilization by going shopping in order to keep the economy going. And so I think that many of us intuitively feel this is insane. But Schumacher, I think, was the first one, through his visit to Asia and exposure to Buddhism, to really put his finger on what the wisdom traditions bring that deeply critique the basis of modern economic theory. So this brings us to the ontological question of who are we as a species? Now, in economic theory, have any of you heard of this sad term, Homo economicus? So Homo economicus effectively is the term used to describe the assumptions made about human nature that underlie the mathematical modeling in modern economics. So the assumption is that we are individuals, that we are unaffected by the behavior of others, that we have perfect information about what happens in the marketplace, and that we are motivated by our personal utility. In other words, that we are competitive, profit-maximizing individuals, not motivated by the society around us. Does that feel like an accurate self-description of yourself? So this is the critical, it's very shallow, but in order to do the mathematical modeling at the root of economics, economists need to make core assumptions about who we are as a species and what motivates our behavior. And so I'm just going to repeat this list, and I just want you to reflect on your own experience of yourself and others and ask yourself, does this feel like an accurate reflection of you as a being? So you are individual, competitive, motivated exclusively by maximizing your own income, profit, utility, and you have perfect information about the marketplace in the past and the future. Anyway, when I said earlier that really for the last century, other disciplines, students from other disciplines have been knocking in the doors of the economics faculty saying, this is simply, this story that you have about Homo economicus is in contradiction to the findings that are emerging from our studies. And so what I want to do is I want to look at what these other faculties, what these other disciplines have been saying about who we really are as a species. So I think most of you are working in cultural studies. Some of you are working in cultural studies. Not true. I think many of you are working in cultural studies. So this is a place where the world of economics and the world of people, cultures, meet. And so what I want to do is to look at some of the evidence coming from other disciplines, which I think reinforces Schumacher's intuition that we are much more complex and cooperative as a species than conventional economic theory suggests. And I want to do that, and then I want to conclude by saying that these insights into who we are as a species and what gives us well-being and wealth actually opens up the door to a whole new way of organizing society that may be much more ecologically benign. Okay, so what we're going to do in the next few slides is just run through some of the findings from other disciplines about who we truly are as a species. So I really enjoy this slide, and again, it satirizes conventional Western man. People are being persuaded to spend money we don't have on things we don't need to create impressions that won't last on people we don't care about. But again, the guy in the top slot has a car, he's got a mobile phone, he's sitting in a traffic jam, he is a successful man, according to conventional economic theory. But there may be a gap between this story and his well-being. Okay, so this is a very intelligent, pioneering thinker called Erich Beinhocker, who's bringing complexity theory into a study of economics. And he is one of the people who's been looking at the range of different disciplines on the basis of which he's saying the myth of the purely self-interested human being takes a hit. Empirical studies find that human behavior is not selfish, but rather attuned to eliciting cooperation in social networks, rewarding cooperation, and punishing free riders. So what we're going to do in the next slide is we're just going to unpack this a little bit by looking at psychology, sociology, anthropology, and looking at what the conclusions that they're coming to about human nature. So this is Daniel Kahneman. Anyone heard of this guy? He was a good, what do you know about it? Tell me. Right?
He is the Nobel Prize winner for his literature. He's talking about people that think in cars is sort of like a bit like practice. You don't have to think before you do, like, if I ask you 2 plus 2, you can directly answer me that it's 4. The slow thinking is something where you have to concentrate on something and then think about it, but sometimes you can lose the other attention, like maybe we have to lecture and then concentrate on the speaker, we realize there's something happening outside here. That's what I know.
Good. You're good students. That's great. So Daniel Kahneman, he's interesting in that he's a Nobel Prize winner in economics, but he's not an economist. Although he has done a lot of work in what he has called behavioral economics. So he's looking at what really motivates human beings, not the theory, but what really motivates human beings. And his book, Thinking Fast and Slow, is it's looking at the different ways, and it's a much more sophisticated psychological understanding of who we are as a species, and the way in which, for example, he's done work that shows that it's describing herd-like behavior, that when some people begin to invest in the stock market, lots of other people flood in afterwards. So our behavior is profoundly influenced by what other people, the behavior of other people. And he introduces the concept of bounded rationality. And bounded rationality means that while we have some power to calculate when we're comparing should we buy this or should we buy this, that actually we're much more inclined to work on the basis of hunch and intuition. So again, the conventional story, and this really is not just economics, this is the whole Western philosophy, is the assumption is that we are rational thinking, we're primarily rational, and that we make decisions on the basis of having judged the evidence, and that's how we reach conclusions. And his studies as a psychologist say, wrong, that actually we tend to make decisions on the basis of intuition and pattern finding. And then, having made a decision, we go in search of the evidence that confirms the decision that we made, not on the basis of rationality, but on the basis of intuition and many other deep stories that we carry within us. So, for example, he would say, Daniel Kahneman would say, if you're trying to persuade people who are currently skeptical about anthropogenic climate change, there are some people who deny that we as a species are contributing to climate change, he would say the wrong place to start is by providing more evidence. Because people are making their decisions not on the basis of statistical evidence, but much deeper pattern-seeking, meaning-making narratives that they're inhabiting that are not to do with the data. So we call on the data to confirm decisions that we have made on a much more intuitive basis. Interesting. So in other words, a core foundation for Homo economicus, that we are perfectly rational and have total control of the facts, is simply being deeply contradicted by the psychology faculty. It's not just Kahneman, there are many others in the field of behavioral economics. There's far more we could, like Kahneman, we could do a whole semester in Kahneman, but I just want to leave you that one little bit. So this is a really, just one little study which illustrates, this is something that Kahneman quotes. So it's a comparison of, these are 48 songs that have been given to students, and they're not able to, they're listening to the songs and then deciding which ones to download. But they've got no information on what the other students are thinking. So they alone are listening to the songs and deciding which ones they like best, and downloading the ones they like best, but they've got no information on what the other students are choosing. And this is what happens when they are able to hear what the others are choosing. So when they don't have any information on what the other students are listening to, there are some that are more popular, some that are less popular, but it's a very broad spread. But as soon as they're able to see what the other students are choosing, this is what happens. This is herd-like behavior. We are, of course, influenced by what other people think and say. We're social animals. Okay, so this is maybe the best book I've read in the last 5 years. Strong recommendation. And this is a US anthropologist whose field work was done mostly in Madagascar. And again, this book is like a one-man assault on the economics profession, where again he's looking at the theories and the stories underlying modern economics and really saying from the anthropological point of view, most of these stories are simply wrong. So for example, a core story that I think certainly in the West, and I'm guessing here as well, that we have simply accepted as being true is where money came from. So it's a story of how money was invented. And I'm going to present you with what it certainly was the story that I was given. And then you can tell me if you recognize the story. And the story is that money was invented because of the inefficiency of barter. So barter means that you simply swap. So the story that certainly that I think most of us were simply given as the story, this is the truth, is that as long as there were only two items in the human economy, barter could work. So there are bearskins and there are clubs. And as long as there's only bearskins and clubs, you swap. One is exchanged for the other. But then as soon as you introduce arrow tips or arrows or jewellery, as soon as you begin to introduce other things, barter no longer works, because what happens if person B has what person A wants, but person A doesn't want what person B has? So you need a means of exchange that is neutral, that will enable people to swap or to exchange within an economy where there are lots of goods and services. Does that make sense? Does that seem true? You think it's true? Does it sound true? Some body language. Okay, so it seems to me this is the story that underpins a lot of justification for economic thinking at the moment. Now, David Graeber is saying, actually, we have never discovered any society anywhere in the world where this was the means that money was introduced, ever. So, big challenge. So where did money go? So what actually happened? And this is maybe 400 pages of detailed analysis from around the world showing that actually what happened was that for most of human history, goods and services were distributed on the basis of gift and reciprocity. That actually money did not exchange hands because money wasn't there. So how would this have worked? And again, Graeber asks us to think of a hunter who has gone to the forest, he's made a kill, and he's brought the animal back into the village. Now, according to conventional economic theory, what he should do is he should set up a stall and he should sell to those who can afford to buy and give nothing to those who can't afford. Market economics. Whereas, in fact, this is not what happened at all. Again, this book is 400 pages of detailed analysis, description of what did happen. And what did happen is the hunter would bring the kill in and he'd give it away, prioritizing the elderly, the young and pregnant women. And in fact, in many cultures, particularly in the Americas, the chiefs were chosen on the basis of who was giving most away. So the chieftaincy was the route to bankruptcy, because you'd be expected to give everything away. So this is a complete contradiction of the dominant story that we have about the primarily selfish, competitive, utility maximizing individual. Now, Graeber is not suggesting that this means that we are a species of angels who are only motivated by giving things away, but rather the commonsensical perspective that if you live in a society that doesn't have a social safety net, that doesn't have a welfare state, your best survival strategy is to develop a reputation for generosity. So this year you've got a surplus, you give it away. Next year you're in trouble, and so you can call on the generosity of other people. And that actually for most of human history, we've lived in groups that have been sufficiently stable that the exchange of goods and services has happened not by counting, not by keeping score, but rather by developing long-term relationships of trust and reciprocity. So again, among the many stories that he tells in this book is the story of how the Phoenicians worked. The Phoenicians were the principal trading people of the Eastern Mediterranean. And even they who were trading along the Silk Route and over to northwestern Europe, they were not using money. So what happened was a trader from Tyre, for example, in Lebanon, was trading with a trader from Marseille, for example, in France, and they would approximately keep score of the value of the goods that were being exchanged. But for the trader in Marseille, if he did not reciprocate, his reputation would have been ruined and no one would ever have traded with him again. So in other words, there wasn't a need to keep score. These were cultures based on reciprocity and gifts. And this is deeply, certainly Graeber suggests, and I want to confirm in my own very strong intuition, that actually we're deep wired for gift and reciprocity. So I think, if you just reflect yourselves on the pleasure you get from giving a great present, I think this deeply ties into our deep wiring as a species that is motivated by generosity and cooperation. So I'm just going to give one little example before I do. This lovely quote from the book. This is from Graeber. Consider the linguist who asked an indigenous hunter from Brazil's Parana tribe why, when he found some big game, he threw a feast, letting his guests eat up all the meat in one orgy of indulgence, instead of thriftily drying the meat to save it for the future. In response, the hunter laughed and replied, "I store the meat in the belly of my brother." So this is building social capital. And just so one little story that that for me, when I hear the story, intuitively feels this really is who we are as a species, is the concept of paying forward. So this is something called Karma Cafe. The word karma will be familiar to you, I'm guessing. Yep. So Karma Cafe it's an idea that was dreamed up by people who had understood these deep anthropological truths and were trying to reactivate this generosity at the heart of the human spirit in a very competitive capitalist context. So it started in San Francisco and now it's gone international. And what happens is that a team of volunteers takes a restaurant, they hire a restaurant for a weekend. And when you walk into the restaurant, your meal is free. It was paid for by the previous person who sat in your seat. And you are given the invitation, but there's no obligation that you pay for the person who will sit next in your seat. And my strong hunch, my strong intuition is that in material terms, nothing changes. In that I suspect that most people probably pay what they would have paid for their own meal. But the frame has been changed in that there's no obligation. And you're receiving an act of generosity from a stranger, and you're giving an act of generosity to a stranger. And you see the films that are made inside these cafes, and people are weeping, they're crying, because of this opportunity to receive and give generosity. And when I hear this story, it just feels profoundly true. And it feels like one of the real problems of the dominant competitive capitalist system we live within is that opportunities to express our deep human instinct for gift and generosity have been repressed under this story of selfish, utility maximizing individualism. So I think a lot of certainly within the eco-village world and much of the world that I've inhabited for the last 20 years, we're continually seeking opportunities to gift give. My neighbour, 2 weeks ago, my neighbour from upstairs sent her daughter down for 4 eggs. We keep chickens, and so they wanted some of our eggs. And she had given her daughter £1 coin. And I gave her the 4 eggs and chased her away. I wasn't interested in taking the money. And then in the middle of the afternoon, she arrived with a big slice of cake. So this is much more playful, generous, opening of the heart way of working that I think, it seems to me that we need to find a way of bringing back into our human cultures. Okay, so what we're doing is we're just looking, we started by looking at psychology and Daniel Kahneman, we then looked at David Graeber and some anthropological research. we're now looking at, and so we're going to continue looking at some fields of study to again challenge this idea of the selfish, individual, rational, competitive Homo economicus. This is from a study called the Spirit Level. And what it's done is it's looked at the industrialized countries of the world and tried to see how significant is income inequality as a factor in social, psychological, societal happiness. So this is simply a summary graph of many of the, so in the book there are lots of individual graphs. This is a summary graph. And it's looking at life expectancy, literacy, infant mortality, and so on, obesity, homicide, social mobility. And always at this end of the graph are the countries with the lowest gap between the rich and the poor. So Japan, the Scandinavian countries at this side, and the Anglo-American red and tooth and claw version of capitalism at this end, US, UK, Australia, New Zealand, where there's a huge gap between the rich and the poor. And asking the question, how do the gaps between the rich and the poor correlate to these various other factors? And finding consistently that the higher the gap between the rich and the poor, the more unhealthy the country is. The higher the rate of drug abuse, of suicide, of childhood pregnancy, of all the different indicators consistently show that countries with a small gap between the rich and the poor are healthier than those with a big gap. Even, perhaps surprisingly, social mobility. So with social mobility, what they did is they measured the incomes of sons to the incomes of their fathers, to see to what degree are people able to escape the class into which they're born. And they found that the country in the world with the lowest social mobility is the United States of America. And in fact, the woman, this book is written by a woman and a man. The woman came to lecture at Schumacher College, and during the presentation, she said, the evidence here suggests that if you want to live the American dream, you need to emigrate to Copenhagen. So in other words, that this country, the story is that anybody can become president is the one that there's the least chance in the world of it happening. Now really, it simply means that countries that look like this are going to be unhappy. This is Sao Paulo in Brazil. This is one photograph, not two. Amazing. So in other words, we are of course influenced by our relative position to others. Now, according to the conventional neoclassical economic theory, the theory that's given is a rising tide lifts all boats. So in other words, if there's economic growth, the poor will benefit maybe a little bit and the rich will benefit enormously, but it doesn't matter as long as everybody is becoming absolutely better off. So even if the gap is rising between the rich and the poor, as long as the poor are becoming a little bit better off, it doesn't matter. Now, this is nonsense, because we are in relationship to others in our society. And so the idea that the people living on the left, who are becoming marginally less poor, will be happy while people are living like that on the other side of the fence, it simply defies common sense, I suggest. Okay, just a couple more bits of evidence. Have you heard of this study, The Tragedy of the Commons? Yeah? Tragedy of the Commons? No. So The Tragedy of the Commons was it was a report written, or it was a study written in the 1960s by a guy called Garrett Hardin, an American biologist, on the basis of no field work. It was purely speculating. And he was saying that the tragedy of the commons means that if you've got land that is not privately owned, but that is governed by a community, it will necessarily become ecologically degraded. And the reason is that it is in the interest of each remember, the theory is that each individual is profit maximizing, not influenced is competitive, profit maximizing, and not influenced by the behavior of others. And so under this theory, it will be in the self-interest of each individual to put more, the example he used was sheep on pasture land. So everyone will individually put more sheep on the pasture land than the pasture can actually hold. Because it's in each person's individual self-interest, and therefore, necessarily, if you have land that is not privately owned but governed by a community, it will tend towards ecological dislocation, overgrazing. Does that sound possible? Does that sound like what does your intuition tell you? Is that a good theory? Is it true?
Possibly like a positive goal. One thing is it should not be about the community government, but no one government. There's a great difference between no one government and community government. Community is we own that, we corporate own that, and we have this our achievement on that thing. So we need to love them, protect them. I think we can think about any difference between community government and no one government, or difference or no difference.
That's exactly the point. That really what he was describing was a context in which nobody was in control. And therefore everyone would have an individual interest to overexploit the resource. However, this is another Nobel Prize winner in economics who was not an economist, called Elinor Ostrom, who spent her life studying community-managed resource and finding that community-managed resource tends to be much more sustainable and much more successfully managed in the long term. So, in other words, the story that Garrett Hardin was saying was we are selfish individualists trying to maximize our own personal selfish utility. But Ostrom's work, in this Nobel Prize winner, the first woman ever to win the Nobel Prize in economics, is saying the evidence contradicts this. The evidence is that actually there tend to be very few areas that are not governed by the community, and when the community is governing it together, the community members set the rules over how the water is shared, how many cattle can go to the pasture land, and that the community actually protects it much better than the individual private property owner. But the tragedy of the commons was critical theory in development workers, development policy in much of the world from the 1980s was you've got to move away from community ownership to private ownership, very much based on his work. But again, the evidence points in the opposite direction. The evidence points in the fact that we are profoundly a participatory, generous, sociable, gift-giving, reciprocal species, and this is what makes us happiest. It's beginning to join up the challenges coming from empirical science that are challenging the story that has lain at the root of the deeply competitive, market-based, individualistic theories underlying economics. And just one little insight here that's really important is psychological studies consistently show that students of economics, law, and business are meaner and less generous than students in other faculties. And this is because of the nonsense that they're taught. If you're taught you are a selfish individualist who is motivated by your personal gain, these are the muscles that get developed. And this is the power of the wisdom traditions, including Buddhism, in telling a different story. And it's a story that is confirmed by the wisdom traditions and increasingly by empirical data from faculties other than Faculty of Economics. So I'm just going to run through the last few slides summing this up. So this is looking at, okay, so first of all, let's just look very quickly at this one. This is a Chilean economist called Manfred Max Neef, whose idea is that actually across all cultures and all periods of human history, there are, he postulates, 9 basic human needs. They look pretty good to me. So these are consistent, but the ways of satisfying the needs are culturally specific. So, and I must say that when I was living in a village in West Africa that was very poor in material terms, but that I found to be culturally very rich, in fact much richer than my own home culture, this really made sense. So, in other words, it's challenging the link between income consumption on the one hand and well-being on the other, saying there are many ways to achieve well-being that tend to be culturally specific. Okay, so we're going to look just at some of the wisdom traditions. Ubuntu is from Southern Africa. Literally it means I am because you are. So it's a deep concept which you also find in Buddhism and in other traditions of deep interconnection, not separation. We don't live in a meaningless mechanical world. We live in a world where we are dependent on each other and derive meaning from our relationships with each other, the real source of wealth and well-being. In the Andean region of Latin America, it's called Buen Vivir is the Spanish term. It's difficult to translate into English, but it's a deeply rooted indigenous understanding that the individual, the community, and the ecosystem are one and indivisible, and if you undermine any of them, we are all impoverished. The Indian tradition of Swaraj, similar, again, looking to interdependence, the community, and the importance of rootedness within the community of all beings. So it's not just humans and the rest, it is the community of all beings, all our relations. So I think one of the curses of the moment that we're living in is that we're presented with lists of first world, second world, third world, best, not so good, worst, and always the United States and Western Europe is at the top and Africa is at the bottom. Always. And Asia is somewhere in the middle. Now this is psychologically enormously damaging for all of us as a human family. And I just want to explain a little bit why with reference to something called the Happy Planet Index. And the Happy Planet Index measures 3 things. It measures ecological footprint, means how much ecological resource we're using, how long we live, and subjective feelings of well-being. So the question the Happy Planet Index is asking is, how much natural resource do we need to consume to live long, happy lives? Very simple, but a beautifully simple question. And when they ask that question and factor in the 3 elements of ecological footprint, subjective feelings of well-being, and longevity, how long we live, we begin to get lists that have Europeans and North Americans way down the list. Now, this is a much more intelligent question than, for example, what size is our economy? Because if the question is what size is our economy, you're measuring lots of things that are very destructive but that add to economic growth. So I want to finish with this one slide that will take a little bit of explaining, but I think it builds on the wisdom traditions and it builds on the evidence coming from psychology, anthropology, sociology, to tell a different story about where we are in our journey as a species. So this is the last one. And by the way, ecological footprint, is this a familiar concept? So ecological footprint it's a composite measure of how much resource we're using and how much waste we're generating. And then translating this into the common denominator of bioproductive land. So according to ecological footprint studies, if everyone had the lifestyle of the average North American, we'd need 5 planets. If everyone had the lifestyle of the average Western European, we'd need about 3.5 planets. And yet the dominant story that we're living within is industrialization and development, as if this was physically possible. Completely impossible. So we need a completely different story. So this is charting ecological footprint on this axis. And this is what's called the fair share line, that if everyone on the planet consumed at this level of consumption, below this level of consumption, it could mathematically be sustainable. And on this axis, we have the Human Development Index. The Human Development Index has been developed by the United Nations, and it includes GDP, gross domestic product, and access to health facilities, access to water, education. It's a composite social measure of well-being. So these are the countries of the world, charted by colour. And so what we find is that the African countries tend to have a sustainable level of consumption, but low human development index. So it means that they're not living long, there's high rate of death in childhood, in childbirth, access to water, access to education is limited. So they're living within their ecological limits, but poor quality lives. The North Americans and the Europeans have got a high human development index, but at the cost of unsustainable levels of consumption. So this is the magic box. Can we find a way of living within our ecological means, but with a high quality of life? And this is a much more intelligent question than the questions that surround development and economic growth, I think. There's only one country that's actually within the box, and it didn't necessarily choose to be there. It was pushed there by American bullying and the collapse of the Soviet Union. There's a long story associated with that. But here we've got Latin American countries, a lot of Latin American countries, and some Asia-Pacific countries as well, that are trying to pioneer ways to high quality of living with no ecological impact. Now, this is, just to conclude, where does this tie in with Schumacher? I think where it ties in is Schumacher's, that what he got from Burma was a deep understanding that because we are a sociable, cooperative, gift-giving, reciprocal species whose well-being is primarily determined by quality of relationships, is that we can have a high quality of life without eating the earth. But as long as we can release the story that happiness is primarily associated with consumption, but it's much more to do with quality of interdependence and relationships, that actually this may provide a route, provided we can change our dominant societal story, it may provide a route to us living high quality, integrated, interdependent, relationship-rich lives without eating further into the fabric of the planet. And so I lied, there's one more slide. The subtitle of Schumacher's book is Economics as if People Matters. I think were he writing the book today, he would say economics as if people and planet matters. But the reason why the people are here right at the centre is the deep challenge to the story about human nature and who we are as a species, on which all the rest of this presentation is based, all the rest of this thinking is based. So it's an unusual lecture on economics that actually looks primarily at the psychology of who we are as a species, because I think it provides us with an exit route from the suicidal path that we're on. And thank you for listening so well for so long. I hadn't meant to speak this long.
CJ to give some response. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm CJ Margaret. I also graduated from Lingnan University a long time ago, and now I'm working in Swaraj University. And also I'm involved in the rural reconstruction movement in mainland China. And last year we have the exchange program with Lingnan University and my university, and we visit Schumacher College. So I'm really learned a lot from the college, and then because not only the teaching staff and student work together, share together, but also guests. We also do the cleaning, cooking, and also planting. So I really share the values, and I agree with Jonathan mentioned that Schumacher. The book is small is beautiful, and Schumacher mentioned that economics as a people, and Jonathan adds the planet matter. And I really agree that because even in that book, in the chapter about the Buddhist economics, Schumacher had already talked about the teachings of trees. The trees actually is a kind of people how we relate to the nature and also of course the animal plants. And it mentions that how we relate to the trees, because trees is actually our teachers. And then I also remember that the Indian poet, actually Schumacher College also has the Indian legacy, because the founder of Dawson Hall actually at that time was the secretary of Tagore during the 1920s, because Tagore also was involved in the rural reconstruction movement in India. So you find that in the last century, the Indian scholars and poets, and of course in China, Liang Shuming has heard of that, all those our senior, all involved in the rural reconstruction movement, because they try to reflect on the problems of modernity and what are the solutions or what are the alternatives. So, but now why we still think that we still have the same problems. Have you noticed? If you have noticed that nowadays we still see trees with a price tag. For example, in Indonesia, you have heard of the forest fire just recently, because the Arab business they set the fire in the forest because it's kind of profit making, and of course, and also in Brazil, the Brazilian government tried to sell the land in Amazon forest. So nowadays, actually, we human beings haven't learned a lot from nature at all. So why we still think that we haven't resolved the problems yet? So why we have to think and work together? Because we say we face the same problem. Yeah. So now it's open to the floor, and we hope we can raise questions and try to find any solution. Why to solve the problems together. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the talk. It was very interesting. It is a question as well as the first most of the response. First of all, let me share a personal story, because I grew up in Lingnan and I went to a college in the States. Okay. So before I went to study in the U.S., I was warned by my family and friends and family friends that don't make friends with people who write in sports cars, and don't sort of pay too much attention to those material stuff in the United States, because it was a very different environment for me personally. But however, to my surprise, or fortunately, I went to a place where people don't drive; they ride bikes.
Vermont?
Yeah, no, well, I went to outside New York, upstate New York. So, and also I lived in eco-friendly housing. It was the first greenhouse, organized like communal living. No, actually, I went to zero hours. So it's very interesting. It's very sort of to me it was educational in a sense. But China has been, China is going through this like tremendous changes, in like economic terms. So I'm wondering, well, even in that chart, China is still in this thing that's, so they have a high economic performance, relatively speaking, and also still in the happy, and well, yeah, in the happy level. So I'm wondering, like, what? But however, the government, or I don't know what their agenda is, but because now you're seeing more and more, they're just growing middle class in China, and they're striving for like more material goods like cars, more houses and stuff like that. So how do you see like what's gonna change in China in like, the next 20, 30, 40 years? And I also have a question for Sitra, like because you are teaching China, so I'm wondering how, if you hold this like philosophy, how do people perceive this sort of thing in mainland China? So that's
Actually, 10 or 15 years, actually we already set up the Yan Chu, James Yan Rural Reconstruction Institute in Hebei. Actually, we already have 10 years of experience in involved in the rural reconstruction movement. And Xiaohui, Pei Yun actually is at that time she was one of the volunteers in that institute. So we already started that project 10 years or 10 to 15 years. And at that time, we introduced the Schumacher book, Small is Beautiful, because we have downloaded the Chinese version. So for us, it's not a new question. Or we already start to respond to the question of the alternative to capitalism and also alternative to modernization. And this is not new at all because our senior, as I mentioned before, Liang Shuming and also Liang Chu, at the early of 20th century, we already had so-called the first wave of rural reconstruction movement. So our senior actually have involved in the how to build the rural society, how to help peasants organize cooperatives, how to get some so-called the rural finance. Rural finance is not a new invention in our society because during their time they always to practice some kinds of micro rural finance, how to channel the money from Shanghai to the countryside. So we try to how to reinforce or recreate what's the experiment in the last century. Of course, our problem is quite different from theirs because now the dominant capitalism is the financial capitalism. It's not at all the industrial capitalism. And then you know that now around the coastal areas, all the factories, many factories, then bankruptcy. And then we have the at least 100 million peasant workers. What's their future? Can they stay in the cities? No way. Otherwise, they like the slum in Brazil, São Paulo, and also Rio de Janeiro. So we really don't want this kind of slums happen in China. If they ask what's the future, so I think the first question you ask yourself, what can you do for the Chinese society, or how can you contribute yourself to our future generation?
So I'm reluctant to speak with any authority about China because it's my first visit. I really don't know. But I know Latin America much better. And I'm sure there must be parallels. And one of the parallels is it's not a question of development as we know it or poverty. There's lots in between. So the development model that we have at the moment, what it's done is it's taken the GDP of Brazil, of Ecuador, of these different countries is increasing, but what's happening is that the land has been transferred from the control of the people to the corporations. And most of the people who previously had some control over their own destinies and lives are now working in slums and factories and And so the profits have gone to the corporations, often Western corporations, while the GDP of the country has gone up. And this is described as success. Whereas there in it's really interesting that that if you look at the path of much of the trajectory of Southeast Asian countries, that the enrichment of the middle class that they've had has not been by following the conventional Western economic model. It's been by land reform, it's been by investing in peasant agriculture and enabling a much more solid foundation of democratic control in their own economies. And so I think that, for example, if you look at looking at the food sector, that the dominant development model is transfer the land into private ownership of corporations and generate employment, and some people will move into the middle class. The most productive use of land is peasant-based agroecology. But the problem is that this is not enriching the corporations, and so it's not being favoured as a development path. So there are many ways I think the rural reconstruction movement in China, certainly the work of people like Schumacher and Tagore in the West, have been I keep starting sentences and not finishing them, but this one is that Tagore, who was mentioned, the Indian thinker and philosopher, who was involved both in the rural reconstruction movement and also in the experiment that Schumacher College is part of in England, was based on three things: on agricultural improvement to improve the productivity of the land, culture and arts, particularly dance, and radical education. So it's not a question of choosing continuing impoverishment. It's more a development model that is much more controlled by the people working on the land, so they retain some control over their resources. Because at the moment, in China, the vulnerability to a crash in the West, where we're no longer able to buy all the stuff coming out of China, leaves China very vulnerable in a way it wasn't 20 years ago. So it's not a question of development or continuing poverty. There is a lot of the middle that we need to explore.
I have two questions. Thank you for a very inspiring talk.
Maybe before the question, I want to tell you that actually I've attended a short course in Schumacher College. Yeah, in 2012. 2012, yes.
2012.
Yeah. Are you there?
I was there then.
July, early July. Maybe we meet. The two questions is, the first one is, how do you comment GDP as a index for well-being or growth of a place? Do you think that we should totally ignore it, or we can change some of the parameters so that it reflects some of the well-being and the satisfaction and like that of that country? Okay, how do you comment GDP? And then the second question is Can I speak in Cantonese?
廣東話應該大家聽過嗬。
即係點講咧？即係人嗰個本性嗰個問題咧，我諗我自己啦，我會明白同埋我都接受。但係問題，我哋自出世以嚟，或者學校教育以嚟已經係俾人洗咗腦啊嘛。即係我哋係覺得要贏在起跑線啊，諸如此類嗰啲。咁點樣解決呢一個所謂社會化，即係 socialization 嗰個問題？
So the first question is GDP, gross domestic product. You're aware of gross domestic product? Yeah? You know what I mean by GDP? So even the guy who created GDP was an economist called Simon Kuznets, and he said, don't mistake this for societal well-being. This is not a way to measure well-being. So, like, the problem we have is that if you think of the global events so GDP measures economic activity. That's it. It's all it measures. And so the Iraq War is fantastic for GDP. So many. the war in Iraq is fantastic. There's so many guns and bombs and the cleanup and rebuilding costs. Oil spills are fantastic for GDP. All the money that's needed to, road accidents are fantastic. All the hospitals and drugs, and so it measures bads as well as goods. And there's so much that gives us quality of life that is simply excluded. So, for example, parenting, excluded. Quality of, are public officials corrupt or not corrupt? Excluded. Gap between the rich and the poor? Excluded. So it's a very, very blunt measure. There are many more intelligent ways of asking.
So we should totally ignore it.
Hmm?
So we should totally ignore it.
It needs to, if we include it, it needs to be in a very low position in the rank. The second question is really interesting, is given that we've been told from the beginning that we are competitive and we've got to be successful, like the successful man in the car, how do we change that? My feeling is that the older story is much more powerful. So, for example, I have a friend who, about a decade ago, the electricity to New York was cut for a week. There was a power station in Toronto where there was a failure in the power station, and so there was no electricity in Philadelphia, New York, Washington for a week. And the stories that you hear of people, the happiness of people inviting people into their homes and cooking for them and parties, and there was a real feeling of upset. When the lights came back on again, it was, we got to go back to work. And actually, in New York, one day every year they remember this, and they have street parties, and it seems to me that that the more cooperative, generous part of our nature is so powerful that as soon as there is a crack, it's like a plant that immediately breaks through. The Karma Cafe thing, for example. And I think that even in the midst of a highly competitive culture, every day there are many acts of kindness and generosity that really, for me, it will not be difficult to rediscover. It's who we are.
Today our talk is about the Buddhist Economics. Actually, many assumptions in conventional economics, as you mentioned, is something about the bad thing or dark side of human nature. For example, selfish, greedy, and rational. Personally, I don't think human is very rational, but only selfish and greedy on the dark side. You mentioned that we have to find something that what species we are. But sometimes I will think we don't know what species we are because we have the dark side and the light side. But we should think about what we to be or something. And you mentioned about that Buddhist economics today. We know in Buddhism, I'm a version of Buddhism. We have to think that why we think is about we are greedy, we are easily get angry, and we are very foolish that we understand anything but we don't know anything. As you mentioned, in this lecture, what technical method in Buddhist economics we can deal with this origin of people, greedy, our greedy, our anger, and our foolish nature.
I think that if you look at pretty much every other discipline, you look at psychology, anthropology, sociology, they will talk about the light side and the dark side. Economics only talks about the dark side. There's no light side. It's only the dark side. So it's not a question of saying we are angelic. It is that there is both. And from the Buddhist perspective, and I also have studied Buddhism, and from the Buddhist perspective, they would say it's almost like there are different muscles. Which muscles will you develop? Will you develop muscles of compassion and empathy and generosity, or will you develop muscles of greed, anger, misunderstanding? hatred. And there are practices, many practices in Buddhism, metta meditation, many practices which are about cultivating generosity and gentleness and the lighter side. So definitely within most wisdom traditions and definitely within Buddhism, there are practices for cultivating one or the other, cultivating the light side. Within the economic sphere, so if I understand the question is, are there practices that are more economic rather than just individual that we can develop to develop the light side? Yeah. And I mean the answer is there are. To some degree, it is where possible making a choice, a lifestyle choice that is more about recognizing that well-being comes from within and from relationships rather than from consumption, and therefore not needing to work so hard, or in the type of job that you choose to do. Or, and this is really difficult, I mean sometimes it can be almost paralyzing, is that when you think about where, for example, your food comes from, and trying to make choices that are, so some of our food is grown under conditions that are deeply destructive socially and ecologically. And I mean the most obvious one is animal products. That consuming animal products, for the most part, in most of the world, involves incredible levels of cruelty and ecological destruction. And so I love eating meat, but I'm a vegetarian because I've looked at the impact of animal farming, and I can't do it. But it's difficult because there's so many. You want to buy a pair of jeans that hasn't been made by slaves in a sweatshop. It's difficult. So, or I want to fly here even though with CO2 emissions. You know, we live in a compromised world, but there are choices we can make.
Hi, Jonathan. Actually, I'm also a Schumacher student. 2 years ago, studying the green entrepreneurship. Yes. Actually, today I came here because I also work in a small enterprise in Hong Kong, and our organization we try to practicing about the fair trade, and also we try to practicing we take care of our farmland, and also the food safety, and also we do lots of customer educations on. We are doing health business, so the traditional Chinese medicine product. But my question is, as one of the Schumacher you mentioned about when he was recent in Burma, he had two inspirations, and one is about achieve abundance by reducing wants, the desire. So, to us as a social enterprise, I would say, this is important to maintain the business, right? But on the other hand, reducing the want means probably is less consumption. So I'm thinking about what's the balance and what is the optimal economic models that as a social enterprise should do in this world, nowadays world. Yeah. Of course, we are not trying to create more supplies, not create more demands and by over supplying products to them. But what is the middle point?
So I'm just going to repeat how I understand it. It's a really good question. You're trying to run a successful social enterprise, a successful business. So social enterprise, the primary reason for creating a social enterprise is to deliver benefit, social ecological benefit, but you also need to break even, you need to make profit. So how, if we're trying to reduce the size of the economy, how can you grow the business? And I think the answer is that it's not as simple as just we need to contract. There are some things that we need to greatly expand, and there are some things that we need to dramatically reduce. And I think that almost by definition, the things that we need to expand are more labor intensive and relationship based. So for example, the industrial agricultural system that we have, and particularly the system around animal products, is profoundly immoral. Massive destruction of ecosystems, of forests being knocked down for grazing of beef, for example. And again, huge use of chemicals and poisoning of workers, deaths of workers from using pesticides, and the flooding of the rivers with the chemicals. Now this needs to stop. Which means that we need a massive expansion in small-scale, peasant-based agroecology. So, which is much more labour-intensive. There's much more employment in that than in the current system. In energy, fossil fuel, particularly coal production, is mostly automated. So it's not providing that much employment, but it's generating planet-destroying, life-destroying CO2. That needs to stop, and it will stop. Which means that we need a massive increase in renewable, in solar, in thermal, in hydro, in wind power, all of which is much more labour-intensive. So, what business are you in? What's your
retailing?
Retail.
Business. Yeah. Selling product.
Yeah. So retailing is difficult because you're trying to persuade people to buy. so what you do is you persuade them to buy products. You specialize. You develop a niche in organic, artisanal, craft-based activities, so that you're actually helping those sectors to increase that will replace those that are very destructive. Now, the problem at the minute you have is that all of the economic incentives, the subsidies, the externalities, the way that the market is rigged makes destructive products much more profitable than those that are not destructive. So, for example, what do you sell? What kind of things do you sell?
It's a herbal drinks, some herbal tea.
Herbal tea?
Yeah, tea, drinks, soup, some snack food, food and beverage.
Good. But so there's many food products that the real costs of growing the food are not included in the price that the consumer pays. So all of the CO2 in the atmosphere, the pollution that's killing the fish in the rivers, the killing of the workers in hospital with pesticide poisoning, these are not on and the death of the fish, the pushing people off the land to make way for the agribusiness farms. These are not, all these very real costs are not included in the price that the consumer pays. So they're subsidized by future generations and by other species, other habitats. And so that makes it really difficult if you're trying to be ethical. So it means that we need not a change in behavior, not just of the individuals in the system, but also in the rules of the game. How we set the taxation, for example. But well done. We need more people trying to make it work. Good luck.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. Recently, we also heard we have recently heard quite a lot of comments from Pope Francis condemning the capitalistic lifestyle and the development model and so on. So I'm just wondering if there are any essential differences between the Buddhist perspective and the Christian perspective.
Until the current Pope, I would have said big differences, but with the current Pope, I think what, I've used Buddhism here, but I've also said it's wisdom traditions. And in these wisdom traditions, I think the critical thing they're saying is that we are much more than this simplistic model of being selfish, aggressive, competitive, that we are much more complex than this picture. And so definitely the Catholic position as well, particularly with the current Pope, would say a similar thing. You would say that we need to develop other than materialist values. And so consequently, I think I could have given the same talk about Catholicism. But it happens that Schumacher drew his insights from the Buddhist world, which is why I started there. But I do, like having studied, I'm Irish, so having studied Catholicism, and also having studied Buddhism, my own feeling is that Buddhism is particularly attuned to self-examination, and to really a deep study of the roots of suffering and happiness. And so I think Buddhism is particularly well, I don't think it's an accident that Schumacher got this from the Buddhist tradition.
For your talk, I'm not sure if my question is too far away, but I think there are two most important physical force that shaping our life. One is, of course, economics. One is state and like government. So I'm wondering if there is a Buddhist economics under the Dawson and Schumacher say something like Buddhist politics or Buddhist state theory that were inspired by his feelings or inspiration from Burma.
So whether we actually have Buddhist economics in practice.
Buddhist politics.
Or how to this system of thought view politics, because it is very obvious and very visible forces that together with economics that is shaping our misery and like our condition now.
So I would say that the two places that I look for these ideas being put into practice, the first is Bhutan. You aware of the Bhutanese experience? Is Bhutan known in China? So then your question was, is there a GDP? Do we keep GDP? Do we let go of GDP? In Bhutan, they measure gross national happiness. And economic policy is based around the achievement of gross national happiness. So they deliberately don't do GDP. And so it includes all sorts of measures that are to do with spirituality and well-being and lots of other criteria other than the economic. The other is the buen vivir, the experience in the Andean countries. And particularly in Bolivia and Ecuador, in both these countries, rights of the earth are written into the constitution. So you can take the governments to court, or you can take corporations to court for crimes against the planet, against ecosystems. And so definitely in both Ecuador and Bolivia, again, the constitution, the heart of economic planning is not economic growth, but is well-being of humans and other species. So in the case of Bhutan, it's profoundly influenced by Buddhism. In the case of buen vivir in Latin America, the Andean region, it's drawn from indigenous wisdom traditions. Does that answer the question? Did I understand the question?
You want something more specifically for the political systems? Can we put Buddhist?
Or how should we view the problem of state?
State. State.
Yeah. Because it enables us to do something as well as it give very vague limits to many things that we do. How can we perceive of the problem of state like under this system of thought?
So can there be a Buddhist state?
Yeah.
Something like that. Or will the Buddha run a state?
The Buddha running the state. Does anybody have an opinion on this? Could the Buddha be running the state?
Sorry, actually not exactly responding to this question, but the original question of Mr. Cha. Actually, my feeling is you can't arouse anger to fight against the anger raised by the government.
maybe to speak more specifically, today the government of Hong Kong aroused many disruption or funding. Polarization. Yeah, the society is very separated. Split up by the government. So at least arouse anger in some of us. So if we arouse more anger of the people to fight against this, I don't think it is going to work. So we should arouse love to fight against anger. And actually, for example, when Jonathan talked about the I forget which answer you give to the question, is how to respond to a wrongdoing of the government is we don't fall into their thoughts. I'll call an example. Actually, I think that you and your partners go into farming and into agriculture is a very good response to the Northeast development fight. Because you are not asking people just to protest, to say not to do this, not to do that, but you actually go into farm. He actually is a farmer now, or part-time farmer at least, and growing food for himself and also for us. And so that means you are going into that question. You are solving the question to fight against that question. I think maybe this is the answer, the Buddhist answer to that problem. Wonder if I can. Maybe I'll do better if I can.
I think the closest experiment I can think of is Bhutan, where I think they would say they're trying. I mean, it's a king. It's not a democracy, but I think they would say that they're trying to create a Buddhist politics.
In fact, it's not question. Just a sort of sharing and response. Whether you, since lunch is coming, whether you take my sharing as an appetizer or dessert, it is up to you to decide. So, in response to Dr. Johnson's sharing, to feel hunger is good for our physical and psychological well-being, and which is the experience sharing of Chinese practitioner and Japanese practitioner. Both of them think that feeling a bit of hunger 3 times a day, which is good for our physical and mental well-being. Because when we feel hungry, I think the English name for that internal organ, that internal organ is generates foods and drinks when we are in a hungry state. And when that internal area, in English, what's Oh, and when we feel hunger, that organ is working, and it will enhance our resistance to sickness and illness. Thank you.
I take the opportunity to ask my question. Yeah, I'm interested in your experience in the eco-villages because I've been working on it and living in eco-villages. How actually your experience and also your analysis of eco-villages contribute to those, particularly the lack of tragedy of the commons. We talk about there should be some more communal or the community efforts than the strategy would not appear. So how do you mind sharing some of your experience of eco-villages in response to that kind of?
Would you like to begin by defining what you mean by
but your maybe in Hong Kong, well, some of us who are here, our friends and like thinking, well, we are, as I said, we're actually working in Langchong and see whether we can have some kind of eco community coming up. Yeah, so as I said, it's more a space that people can come together. Yeah, and then there's mutuality, yeah, reciprocity, yeah, and also and can sustain life. Yeah, and people can really work together and live together, and I think as a whole it also reduces this ecological footprint and then self-reliance, more the self-reliance of food. Yeah, and yeah, there are many other things that an eco-village can achieve. Yeah, so but we're just at the beginning stage, so I'm very much interested in your experience.
And so the question specifically was,
how would it contribute, the experiences, the global movement of eco-villages contribute to these Buddhist philosophies of economics?
At the beginning, in your introduction, you said I used to be the president of the Global Eco-Village Network, which is the umbrella organization for eco-villages around the world. And so for the last 20 years, I've lived in 3 different eco-villages and have seen many around the world. There's a lot of diversity. There's no one thing called an eco-village. There's so many different models. But I think that our lineage is a monastic lineage, which means that really even though almost all eco-villages are secular, they don't have a particular religion or teaching, that we're performing a similar role to that performed by monasteries in previous years. So they're places of calm, reflection, healing, cooperative work. And I think they're very powerful in terms of as places where people can come. So, for example, in the biggest community that I lived in was called Findhorn in Scotland, and there the community is a net exporter of renewable energy. It grows a lot of organic seasonal food, vegetarian food. We have our own community currency, so we're focused on keeping the wealth, the economic wealth in the community circulating locally. We have Scotland's only manufacturer of thermal solar panels. There's a Steiner school, like a very child-centered educational center. So it's like, in terms of food production, the ecological building techniques. So it's a place where you could go and see how would it be if we did ethical food production, ethical economy, ethical building techniques, education, if we did them all together on an experimental basis. And so I think it's really important that they perform an educational role, because if it really is only for the benefit of people living there, it can become elitist. So it needs to be, I think the eco-villages that are successful are those that are consciously in service to the wider society. So the different experiments that are undertaken need to be for making the world a better place rather than just improving the life of those living. But maybe you can read my book and then tell me afterwards when we can talk again.
Hi, thank you for the talk. This is very interesting to relate religious to economics. I'm not an economist, okay, but I have a very naive and very general questions to ask. So, if you can relate the Buddhism philosophy to the economics, right? Can you relate, for example, Catholic philosophy into economics and how Catholics really affecting modern economics? Because it would be a very interesting point, because Christians or Catholics should be one of the most believed religious in the world, and that religious should have the huge impact to how a country develop or how modern economics is currently have. So what do you think about Catholics relate to modern economics?
This is similar to what I was saying before with Catholics, but I think the wisdom traditions that I've looked at include Buddhism, include Ubuntu, include Swaraj, and what these traditions have in common is they question the simplistic version in economics that we are only competitive, selfish, looking for our own maximum benefit, and saying this is not true. I mean, it's that it's not. I mean, we are competitive and selfish, but we are many other things as well, and that actually our success as a species is more to do with our capacity for cooperation than competition. So I think the wisdom traditions. The wisdom traditions are really contradicting economics by saying, in addition to being competitive and selfish, we are also very sociable and generous as well. And if we only focus on the competitive selfish, we're missing much of what is best about the human condition. And so Catholics, like Buddhists, would say this. And so I really focused in on Buddhism because of Schumacher's own journey. But I could have given the same talk about Catholicism.
Okay, so yeah. So we're hungry. Huh? Okay, so thank you very much. Yeah, so that's